We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
America's foundation was from the start intended to be a biblical vision of society and life. Most of our founding fathers were not themselves theologians, but they thought from a Christian worldview.
The Judeo-Christian values are the bedrock of Western civilization. They are the bedrock and foundation of the United States of America. Our founding fathers knew exactly what they were doing when they founded this nation and gave us the law that we have today.
On July 4th, 1776, delegates from the 13 colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence. This ushered in vast freedom and prosperity for this new nation, which was founded upon biblical principles.
Our history has empowered more people, given them the greatest levels of economic prosperity, the greatest levels of personal freedom to speak, to disagree with the government, to criticize the government, to assemble, and to encourage people to think like us. Those are some fundamental rights that we were given by God, enshrined in the Constitution and protected by government, that make us unique.
Where are people the freest and most prosperous? And those places will be places where the gospel has advanced the farthest and the freest.
Meanwhile, just a decade later, in 1789, the French Revolution began. A revolution that was amoral and godless.
Students of history have long observed the difference between what happened in America with the revolution that took place and the revolution that took place in France shortly thereafter. The American Revolution was driven by biblical principle. Those who were leading that believed that God was and that God needed to be honored. In France, there was a different spirit. Those who led that revolution were seeking to release themselves from any of God's demands or commandments.
They're entirely different in their sources and 100 other ways down the line. The American Revolution comes out through the Reformation from the Hebrew Scriptures, above all Exodus and Deuteronomy. The French Revolution has its sources in the French Enlightenment, Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau. And then you go on down the line. They have a very different view of humanity.
The American War for Independence has been called the American Revolution, but some scholars question if it really was a revolution at all, in terms of the rule of law.
You know, originally revolution was a scientific idea. A heavenly body would come back in a circle and then end where it started. But when that was applied to politics, there was a sense of moving forward.
Independence Day is the celebration of not just American independence, but of a doctrine of what I call interposition. It is not a revolution technically, it is not a revolt or rebellion. It is interposition of duly elected state officials throughout the state of the American colonies against a tyrant who no longer had a legitimate basis to rule.
In other words, the Founding Fathers were attempting to make the King of England and leaders in Parliament follow the rule of law. However, the spirit of the French Revolution was far different.
In the American Revolution, humans are sinners, and so you need checks and balances and a separation of powers. The French Revolution is utopian. And as you know, whenever you have a gap between the ideal, which is unrealistic, and the real, it is filled eventually by violence. And so the radical left is always violent and coercive, growing out of their view of human nature. The famous saying of Diderot, "We will never be free until we strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest." In other words, in France, church and state, throne and altar, were one, and both were oppressive, so the revolution threw off both. You see the genius of the American Revolution. You have a separation of church and state, so faith flourishes despite disestablishment. For a simple reason, it's based on the voluntary dictates of conscience. In other words, that supports freedom, so there's nothing to react against.
While the stark differences between both revolutions are clear, the societies that they formed in the aftermath are equally dissimilar.
Everyone understands that there are essentially only two kinds of societies. You have the Abrahamic vision of a society based on good people, on religious people, as many of the founders of the United States of America wrote in their writings of the period, that the system only works for people who are intrinsically and internally guided by a biblical vision of goodness. And the only other system is essentially one that always becomes a tyranny, and that is a center where it's not the Bible that is cited as the source.
Here in the United States of America, our ideas were constitutional government. Let's write down the rules and limit the size and the scope and the authority and the rule of the central national government. The rule of law was essential in our country. Under the French Revolution, it was the rule of the leaders of the totalitarian regime. The whole idea of concentrated power versus separation of powers.
While our nation's strong biblical foundation is abundantly clear, many of the radical ideas that spawned the French Revolution have crept their way into American society.
The spirit of the French Revolution permeates Marxism.
There's no question that the sans-culottes of the sans-culottes of the French Revolution are active. I mean, they're definitely walking around looking for heads they can put up on a pike.
And the Jacobins, who were the ones who erected the guillotines that killed something like 40,000 people in Paris during the French Revolution and right afterward, are very much the spirit of today's left. In fact, it was kind of ironic that some leftists actually erected a miniature guillotine outside the house of Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon and the Washington Post, saying, well, he's part of the ruling elite, so we've got to take off his head someday.
Karl Marx himself identified Christianity as one of the chief impediments to the establishment of globalized workers of the world united. Christianity has been consistently identified as one of those threats. And the reason is, if you're advancing a philosophy that requires people to be perpetually and irrepressibly oppressed and victimized, then a message that says, no matter where you come from, there's hope in Jesus Christ. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. The core of Christianity is hope. Any ideology or philosophy, especially the theology of Christianity that gives people hope, is diametrically opposed to an atheistic or an agnostic Marxist worldview.
With the introduction of critical race theory in our public schools and other Marxist ideas being pushed by the radical left, America has begun to slip away from the foundations we were built upon.
Marx's idea of conflict theory, really reducing all of life to conflict between groups over limited resources. When you're talking about cultural Marxism and sort of practical application of critical theory, if you will, you got to remember that the idea and the intention and the goal was a Marxist overthrow by force.
And I think we can say over all the history of the radical left, revolutions never succeed and oppressions never end.
That's why Bible-believing Christians in this country now must begin to resist the power of evil, stand on biblical truth, and make clear that you are willing to suffer consequences if they come for your stand, but you will not surrender ground. You will not give up.
There's not a nation in history that has survived forever. It has to be decided from generation to generation to generation. So we were started very much on a God basis. There were flawed people. They made mistakes, no question about it. But their heart was to pursue God and His principles. And if we pursue that ourselves, we'll be a safe nation. If we don't, we're going to be in trouble.